Hi, my name is Betty Rothstein, and I'm with Defend J20 Resistance. I'm here to support people who are facing, or who are going through trial right now, facing felony charges from the January 20th protests.
My name is Jude Ortiz. I'm also with Defend J20 Resistance. I've been kind of working in solidarity with the defendants since January or like early February. I'm also a member of Tilted Scales Collective. That's kind of how I got connected to the defendants and other supporters. Our kind of working draft of the book for defendants that we wrote as a collective came out, and we had the working draft on January 20th, so we were able to send it out to defendants right away and get connected that way. So I've been kind of involved in support and solidarity ever since.
On January 20th, that was Inauguration Day, and masses of people came to Washington, D.C. to counter the inauguration of Trump. And there were protests and demonstrations and marches all day long. And at one in particular, the anti-fascist, anti-capitalist march, over 200 people were mass arrested and brutalized by police, and are subsequently facing felony charges and decades in prison.
The prosecutor has done a lot of really interesting, not super unusual, but very telling things in the prosecution. So initially when over 200 people were arrested, they were all charged with a felony count, and then that quickly changed to a handful of felonies. People were facing 10 years in prison. And then in April, kind of late April of this year, they added on a whole bunch more charges, including conspiracy. So people were initially facing 75 years, when that is actually the second superseding indictment, so the third indictment. And another way to look at that is the third attempt by the prosecutor to put some charges down. And then since then, the judge has actually kind of rolled those back a lot by saying that some of the charges of assault against a police officer were based on outdated statutes, so those got taken off. Other charges were filed as felonies, so conspiracy to riot and engage in a riot were filed as felonies, and the judge was like, no, those are actually misdemeanors. So those got scaled back. And then in the first trial that just concluded today, after the prosecutors went through all their evidence, showed everything to the jury, the judge threw out the inciting a riot felony charge for these 6 defendants on trial. That knocked it down to 50 years in prison. So you also look at that as 3 times when the state's case got kind of knocked down by legal challenges and legal proceedings, because it's actually literally fabricated charges.
So the way that the state is responding to these arrests is they're trying to set a precedent of heavy-handed repression against people who come out in dissent of the Trump administration. And I mean, this was specifically the anti-fascist, anti-capitalist march. And so it's definitely about political association and trying to quash that dissent.
And some other things that have come up through the kind of legal bickering about jury instructions and whatnot is, in addition to the conspiracy charges that are saying that everybody who was arrested was engaged in this thought crime, this alleged conspiracy or alleged plan to go and riot. There's also the aiding and abetting elements to the property destruction charges. And with that, which is a very common legal concept people hear about on TV shows and whatnot. But basically, in this case, it works that if anybody is in the presence of an alleged crime being committed and they have the intent to help that crime happen, then they're just as culpable or guilty as people who allegedly broke the window or whatnot. So it's kind of a gateway for the prosecutor to say actually everybody who was there was guilty of everything that happened and all allegedly happened. So that opens up these very powerful tools for the prosecutors to just say everyone who protests is guilty whenever the police declare something illegal.
The prosecution is targeting actually just basic elements of protest organizing, and street medics have been a core part of protests and demonstrations for decades. And what street medics do is they're available in really chaotic situations, and especially in situations where like there is police violence happening against demonstrators, especially with like pepper spray or like the stinger grenades that were deployed that day. And medics are the first responders who are able to care for people. And so the prosecution has been trying to go after medics in that sense because it's a part of like their association.
When you look at all of the police apparatus that they had out there, all the like the mobile and stationary cameras, all of the body-worn cameras, all of the like other police surveillance devices out there, and security surveillance footage, the Department of Homeland Security helicopter that was circling over the march, like all of that shows that the police were like actually like preparing for war and acting in like these paramilitary ways that were supported like physically on the ground by National Guard and also in the air by Department of Homeland Security. So saying that people being there with first aid equipment or preparing for like when the police crack down on dissent and like mass arrest people, saying that that is preparing for war is just a totally nonsensical statement and like argument. And what if anything, it shows that people have like learned from the history of police repression in the United States and have like gone out in the streets like knowing that they're going to get cracked down on. And in the case that we saw a lot from footage in the trial, like physically pushed down by the police and pepper sprayed and like had like grenades basically thrown at them. They call them sting balls, but they're projectile weapons that explode with like loud noise and pepper spray.
So something that was initially really striking to me was the cross-examination of Detective Pemberton, who is the lead detective on the investigation, and has been like watching and taking notes on all people coming in and out of the courthouse. And so during the cross-examination, his political bias was revealed when screenshots of his Twitter account were put up. It was really indicative of the way that the government in building its case is relying on far right and alt-right organizations to gather evidence. Like Pemberton had worked with Project Veritas in order to get footage. He actually got really flustered in court when all of this was revealed because it was something that he was clearly trying to hide. That's same for the prosecution. The prosecution didn't want it revealed that they were getting footage from Project Veritas and using those sources. And they tried to say that it's not important, but it's actually incredibly important because that's the way that this case has been playing out the whole time.
And the prosecution's even gone even like farther than that. It's like as atrocious that they were relying on this kind of so-called investigation by these like far right and alt-right sources. But then they also, like the prosecutor at one point when she was trying to hide the source of the Project Veritas video and not say in court like who had produced the video, even said that the source or like the kind of genesis of evidence doesn't matter. But that's actually a very fundamental part of like their criminal legal system, is that where evidence comes from matters. And like it can be admitted in trial, but it can be given lesser or greater weight. And the police have this concept called chain of custody that one of the other cops later on testified to about how pieces of evidence were handled like or transferred from like one department or cop to the other, because actually it's true that the source and the kind of history of evidence matters. And then today in closing arguments in the rebuttal argument, that same prosecutor said at one point that reasonable doubt doesn't mean a whole lot. And reasonable doubt is this legal concept that the jury is supposed to find people guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. In this state, the government is supposed to prove beyond that reasonable doubt that people are in fact guilty of what's been charged. And so the judge immediately jumped in and said like, oh, actually no, jury, this is important. This is very, very important. And it's really notable how the prosecutor, in addition to being willing to work with the like far-right, ultra-conservative, and like clearly biased and discredited sources, is also willing to throw out the basic tenets that her job is supposed to be like supporting and defending in order to get convictions on these politically motivated charges.
Like I said, they're like testing this out, and it's already creating a chilling effect in protest organizing, where people are going to look at this, and if you're going to be facing decades in prison for being a part of a protest, it's going to make people start to question whether they should actually do that. And so that's why it's a really dangerous precedent that the government is trying to establish.
And some of that chilling effect is definitely the charges, the severity of all the time that people are facing. And there's also the way the prosecution has worked. We already mentioned the Project Veritas video, and that video was coming from one of their operatives who had, or seemed to have, like a button-worn camera, or a camera hidden in a button, and was doing this like kind of surreptitious recording. And then that became a very crucial part of the government's case against these defendants, like not just in this trial block, but like all 194 of them who are still facing charges. And there's also the at the same meeting where the Project Veritas person was like doing that surreptitious filming, there's also an undercover cop. And then at Logan Circle, there's at least 3 plainclothes cops like who had like their guns and like handcuffs and pepper spray, all that, but they were there just dressed in normal clothes, like to monitor and surveil. And we see all this, like all the surveillance that was happening, how that tied in with National Guard and Department of Homeland Security, and all these things. And in addition, like after January 20th, the government also immediately put in requests for data from people's iCloud accounts to get all this data that they were maybe not able to get off of people's phones, or if people got arrested and they didn't have phones on them, then the government was not able to get this data, so they try to get it in these other ways. There's also been search warrants against Facebook accounts. There's been the subpoena against the web host for disrupt J20.org, which tried to collect information on 1.3 million IP addresses. So it's all these different things, and it's like very broad, like literal dragnet, trying to get all this information and data. And not only is it very scary for the defendants, but it's designed to send this message to everybody else that like, if you're trying to like protest, don't have planning meetings, don't put up a website, don't use social media. In fact, don't even associate, don't talk, don't get out in the streets, don't do anything. That's the message that it's trying to send. And we've obviously been like combating that with support and solidarity for the defendants. But like everyone who is out there, who is like in resistance, who is like dissenting, needs to understand that, needs to like change like tactics and stuff to protect against those attacks from the government.
Something to note about this case is that it's even absurd that it's happening and that it's come to trial. The charges should have been dropped long ago because there hasn't been a full investigation into police conduct on that day. There was money set aside to do that, but it hasn't been completed, and we could see from all of the footage and evidence revealed in court that the police were acting incredibly violently towards protesters, and the police also like have their own biases against the people who are demonstrating.
So I had a lot of trouble not scoffing audibly, like in the courtroom when the prosecutor was talking about the defendants and like other protesters who were there in the streets on January 20th, like coming at this with a lot of privilege and entitlement to, expect that the police would, God forbid, like do what their rules say they should do. And her use of that language, which she hadn't used anywhere else, into actually the final word in the trial, I think was just as much of a desperate move as like the far right groups that have kind of sprung out of the internet and like into the streets or into people's trying to infiltrate groups and stuff, where they're actually taking like radical left ideology and words and slogans and iconography and dress. Like a lot of times, like they'll have like kind of far right people who are going out almost like in what it can often be called black bloc, but usually they're dressed much more like riot cops, but without any badges or insignia or anything like that. And they're taking a lot of this like imagery and they're trying to use it as their own and kind of like recuperating and co-opting like our movements and our struggles. And for the prosecutor who has relied so heavily on far-right sources of information to then do that same recuperative move is like very telling of like not only how that is a continuum of attacks on us and trying to subvert like movements for liberation, but is also this a further sign of the overt collusion between this prosecution and the far right.
We've been watching as like charges get shaved away as we've been proceeding. In fact, the next trial group after this one is only facing 3 misdemeanor counts and the prosecution has already dropped their felony charges against them. And like we watched the incitement charge get dropped as well by the judge in this case. And so I think we're watching it sort of fall apart before our eyes. But that isn't to say that it's like a victory at all. The mass arrest happened without a dispersal order first, and the prosecution has been trying to argue that actually sirens and deploying pepper spray and grenades is a form of dispersal order, but that's just blatantly not true. And it's just another place where the government is trying to push a boundary for us to accept that like they don't need to issue a dispersal order before making an arrest. And that's something that could set a very dangerous precedent, like not just in protest organizing, like anywhere. The government actually spent over $200 million on Inauguration Day for security for the whole event. And the Metropolitan Police Department alone spent over $300,000, and that includes $42,000 dedicated just to less lethal weapons, including pepper spray and the stinger grenades that they deployed at protesters that day.
In this first trial, the 6 defendants are kind of collectively being alleged for the 5 windows that came out to about $80,000, if I remember correctly, from trial, and which is, you know, an infinitesimal like fraction. It's nothing compared to those other numbers. And I think it's also important to know that like all the money that they spend on those so-called less lethal weapons, like the pepper spray and the sting balls and all that, those stay with MPD after the inauguration, and they stay with MPD as they go into neighborhoods such as Berry Farms, which one like overtly racist cop was kind of talking about in a derogatory way, and that cop, like he said that herding people into the kettle was like herding people in this like African American low-income project, Berry Farms. And so these cops who have like that history and those like mentalities, all that, also have this bonus of all these additional weapons to use on these communities day in and day out for however long they last.
So this has been incredibly disruptive to the lives of the defendants. Many of them lost their jobs and have had to subsequently move to DC because fighting these charges is a full-time job. And that's why it's really important that people have been like coming together to support people because it is actually a lot of work doing this.
So to donate, people can go to defendj20resistance.org/donate. We have had a fundraiser going, and there's been various regional fundraising efforts for defendants because everybody's spread out across the country. And we launched a huge fundraiser on the eve of trial with a goal of $250,000 to help support defendants going through trial, starting in November with the first trial all the way through October of next year, which is like how the things are currently scheduled. And so again, defendj20resistance.org/donate is a place to go. The last I looked at it a few days ago, we are at maybe $56,000. So people all across the country, all across the world have been pouring in money to support the defendants. That money has helped us do things like make sure that the defendants have housing, because like Betty said, the people have had to move here like to fight these charges, and also have been able to provide support for defendants and supporters to go to court, be there every day. It's really expensive to get around DC. We've also been able to work with a collective called Pots and Pans to provide food to people for lunch, which also makes it way easier for people to be here since DC, everything in DC is expensive, including food. And so all of these different efforts have been pulled together by people across the country who support and defend the defendants, and donations from other people help make all this possible.